What happens when one of television's most beloved comedians walks into a conversation that was never meant to be fair? In just 42 seconds, a simple question turned into a full-scale public meltdown that left audiences stunned and one host scrambling to save face in front of millions. The studio lights were bright that morning as Conan O'Brien settled into the guest chair at The View. He'd done 1,000 interviews before, always with that signature charm and quick wit that had made him a household name for decades. The audience clapped and cheered as Whoopi Goldberg introduced him, setting what seemed like a friendly, lighthearted tone for the segment. But from the moment Sunny Hostin opened her mouth, something felt different. "So Conan," Sunny began, leaning forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've had quite the career, but let's talk about the real issue here. Your show has been criticized for years for not being inclusive enough. How do you respond to people who say you've benefited from privilege your entire life?" The audience went quiet. This wasn't the playful banter anyone expected. Conan, ever the professional, kept his composure. "Well, I think that's a pretty broad statement," he said calmly. "I've always tried to hire talented people regardless of their background. My writing staff has been diverse. My crew has been diverse. I think if you look at the actual work, you'll see that." Sunny cut him off before he could finish. "But you're deflecting," she said, her voice rising slightly. "We're not talking about your staff. We're talking about you. A white man who's been handed opportunity after opportunity while others have had to fight for scraps. Don't you think it's time you acknowledge that?" Joy Behar shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Whoopi's expression remained neutral, but there was a tension in her jaw. Sarah Haynes looked down at her notes, clearly not expecting this turn. Conan took a breath, still maintaining his trademark composure. "I don't think I've been handed anything," he said. "I worked my way up from writing on small shows, spending years in rooms learning the craft. I've failed publicly more than once. I think reducing anyone's career to just their identity misses the point of what it takes to succeed in this industry." "Oh, here we go," Sunny said, throwing her hands up dramatically. The "I worked hard" defense. "Do you know how insulting that is to people who have worked twice as hard as you and gotten half as far? You really don't see it, do you?" The audience was completely silent now. You could feel the discomfort radiating through the studio. Alyssa Farah Griffin finally spoke up, trying to redirect. "I think what we're trying to get at, Conan, is just an acknowledgement of the broader industry issues," she said diplomatically. But Sunny wasn't done. "No, that's not what I'm trying to get at," she interrupted. "I'm trying to get him to admit that he's part of the problem, that his success is built on a system that was designed to keep people like him on top, and people like me fighting for a seat at the table." Conan's expression shifted. The friendly smile was gone, replaced by something more serious. "With all due respect, Sunny, Sadi, you're sitting at a table on national television, making assumptions about my life and career without knowing the full story. You're attacking me personally for systemic issues that are much bigger than any one person. And frankly, it's not a fair conversation." "Fair?" Sunny's voice went up an octave. "You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you about fair. Fair is watching qualified people get passed over because they don't fit the mold. Fair is having to prove yourself 10 times over while people like you get the benefit of the doubt. Don't lecture me about fair." Whoopi finally stepped in, her voice measured but firm. "Sunny, I think we need to let him answer without interrupting." But Sunny was on a roll, her face flushed with emotion. "No, Whoopi, I'm tired of tiptoeing around this. We bring people on this show, and we softball them with easy questions while they sit there and pretend they don't see their own privilege. It's exhausting, and it's dishonest." Conan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You know what's exhausting?" he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge now. "Being invited onto a show under the pretense of a friendly interview, and then being ambushed with accusations and personal attacks. If you wanted to have a debate about industry inequality, That's one thing. But this isn't a debate. This is a prosecution, the audience murmured. A few people even clapped, but they quickly stopped when they realized the tension wasn't breaking. Joy tried to lighten the mood. Maybe we should talk about your new project, she offered, smiling nervously. Sunny turned to Joy sharply. No. Joy, we're not moving on. This is important. She turned back to Conan, pointing a finger at him. You come in here with your jokes and your charm, thinking you can just smooth over the hard conversations. But I'm not letting you off the hook. You need to own your part in perpetuating inequality. Conan's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting casually in his lap, now gripped the arms of the chair. I don't need to own something I haven't done, he said, his voice firmer now. You're making accusations based on assumptions. You don't know my story. You don't know the struggles I've had, the doors that were closed to me, the times I've failed and had to start over. You're reducing my entire life to a checkbox on some form of identity politics, and that's not fair to me or to anyone else. Identity politics, Sunny repeated, laughing bitterly. There it is. The phrase people use when they don't want to talk about real issues affecting real people. Sarah Haynes finally jumped in, trying to play peacemaker. I think there's truth on both sides here, she said carefully. The industry does have problems, and individual people also work hard. Maybe we can find some common ground. But Sunny waved her off. There's no common ground when someone refuses to see reality, she said. Conan, you're a smart man. You know how this works. You know the advantages you've had. Why can't you just say it? Conan leaned forward now, his elbows on his knees. Because you're asking me to confess to something like I'm guilty of a crime, he said. You're asking me to apologize for existing, for working, for succeeding. And I won't do that. I've spent my career trying to lift people up, trying to create opportunities, trying to make people laugh regardless of who they are or where they come from. If that's not good enough for you, then I don't know what else to say. Alyssa nodded slowly, but Sunny scoffed. Lift people up, she mocked. That's rich. You've lifted yourself up just fine. And now, you want credit for doing the bare minimum? The audience shifted in their seats. Some looked shocked. Others looked angry. A few looked like they wanted to leave. Whoopi cleared her throat loudly. Okay, I think we need to take a breath here, she said. This is getting a little heated. Heated? Sunny turned to Whoopi. Are you serious right now? We finally have someone here who can speak to these issues, and you want to shut it down because it's uncomfortable? Whoopi's expression hardened. I want to shut it down because you're attacking our guest, she said plainly. This isn't an interview anymore. This is something else. Sunny's face went red. I'm attacking systemic problems, she shot back. If he feels attacked, maybe that's because he's part of the problem. Conan stood up abruptly. The movement was so sudden that everyone on the panel froze. He reached up and unclipped his microphone, the wire dangling as he pulled it free from his collar. You know what? He said, his voice steady but cold. I came here as a guest. I thought we were going to have a conversation. But this isn't a conversation. This is an ambush. And I don't need to sit here and be talked down to by someone who's already decided who I am without knowing me. Sunny stood up too, her chair scraping against the floor. Running away, she challenged. That's very telling. Conan turned to face her directly. I'm not running away, he said. I'm choosing not to participate in whatever this is. You want to have a real conversation about real issues? I'm happy to do that. But this is just you performing your righteousness for an audience, and I won't be your prop. The audience gasped. Some people started clapping, but others booed. It was complete chaos in the studio. Joy stood up, her hands out in a calming gesture. Conan, please, let's just take a minute, she pleaded. But Conan was already walking toward the edge of the set. I've taken enough minutes, he said over his shoulder. Thank you for having me, or not having me. whatever this was. Sunny called after him, her voice shrill. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't handle being challenged, so you run away. You're proving my point. Conan stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back one last time. No, Sunny, he said, his voice echoing through the studio. I can handle being challenged. I've been challenged my whole career. What I can't handle is being disrespected in the guise of social justice. There's a difference between challenging someone and attacking them. You crossed that line about 5 minutes ago. He turned to Whoopi. I'm sorry it ended this way, he said genuinely. I've always respected you and this show. But I won't sit here and be treated like this. Whoopi nodded slowly, her face unreadable. I understand, she said quietly. Sarah looked like she was about to cry. Alyssa stared at her hands. Joy's mouth hung open in shock, but Sunny wasn't backing down. You're a coward, she called out. You had a chance to be honest, to be real, and you chose your ego instead. The audience erupted in mixed reactions. Some shouted support for Conan. Others cheered for Sunny. It was absolute pandemonium. Conan shook his head slowly, a sad smile on his face. You know what the saddest part is? He said. You actually believe that. You actually think that anyone who doesn't agree with your exact worldview is a coward or part of the problem. That's not justice. That's not progress. That's just self-righteousness. He walked off the stage without another word. The cameras followed him as he disappeared behind the curtain, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that followed. Sunny stood there, her chest heaving, her face flushed. Good, she said loudly. We don't need people like that anyway. But the audience wasn't having it. The boos grew louder. People started shouting. Security had to step in as the crowd got more agitated. Whoopi stood up, trying to regain control of her show. We're going to take a break, she announced, her voice strained. We'll be right back. But as the cameras cut away, you could still hear the chaos in the studio. Sunny arguing with producers, audience members yelling at each other, the other hosts trying to figure out what just happened. What was supposed to be a lighthearted interview with a beloved comedian had turned into one of the most explosive moments in daytime television history, all because one host couldn't separate a conversation from a confrontation, all because she decided that being right was more important than being respectful. The tension had been building from that very first question, the condescending tone, the refusal to listen, the personal attacks disguised as social commentary. Conan had tried to engage honestly, had tried to respond thoughtfully, had tried to maintain his dignity. But there's only so much anyone can take. When Sunny made that first accusation, calling him privileged without knowing his story, the audience could feel the shift. When she interrupted him repeatedly, not letting him finish a single thought, the discomfort grew. When she mocked his answers and twisted his words, the anger in the room became palpable. Joy had tried to step in multiple times, her voice gentle and pleading, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Sunny shut her down every time, insisting that this was important, that they needed to have this conversation, that she wasn't going to let him off the hook. Sarah's attempts at finding middle ground were met with dismissive waves and sharp retorts. Even Whoopi's authority as moderator was challenged openly, right there on live television. Sunny was so convinced of her own righteousness that she couldn't see how she was destroying the very platform she claimed to care about. Alyssa sat frozen through most of it, clearly uncomfortable but unsure how to intervene. Her few attempts to speak were drowned out by Sunny's increasingly aggressive tone. The audience had come expecting laughs. They'd come expecting stories about comedy and television, and maybe some playful banter about current events. Instead, they witnessed a public shaming that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. You could see it on Conan's face as the interview progressed. The initial surprise when Sunny's first question came out sharper than expected. The professional patience as he tried to answer honestly. The growing frustration as she interrupted and talked over him. The moment of decision when he realized this wasn't going to get better. His hands had gripped the chair arms tighter with each accusation. His smile had faded gradually until it disappeared completely. His responses had started friendly and open, but grew shorter and more defensive as the attack continued. When he stood up and removed his microphone, it wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a dramatic exit for effect. It was a man who had reached his limit and made a choice to preserve his dignity rather than continue being berated on national television. The sound of that microphone hitting the table echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Everyone knew in that moment that something irreversible had just happened. Sonny's face, when he stood up, showed shock, then anger, then something like triumph. She thought she'd won. She thought his leaving proved her point about privilege and fragility and all the buzzwords she'd been throwing around. But the audience's reaction told a different story. The mix of gasps and cheers and boos reflected a room full of people who had just watched something deeply uncomfortable unfold. They'd watched a guest be ambushed. They'd watched a host abuse her power. They'd watched a conversation turn into a confrontation that nobody asked for. When Conan said he wouldn't be her prop, you could hear people in the audience agreeing out loud. When he called out the difference between challenging someone and attacking them, several people stood up and applauded. When he walked away, a significant portion of the crowd started chanting his name. The other hosts looked shell-shocked. Joy's face showed genuine distress. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. Alyssa stared at Sonny with something between confusion and disappointment. Even Whoopi, normally unflappable, looked shaken. But Sonny stood there, defiant, doubling down on her behavior, even as the room turned against her. She called him a coward as he left. She insisted they didn't need people like him. She told the audience and her colleagues that she was right, that she'd done nothing wrong, that he was the problem. The disconnect was staggering. She genuinely couldn't see that she'd crossed every line of professional courtesy and basic respect. She'd turned an interview into an interrogation, a conversation into a trial, and a guest into a defendant. When Conan stopped at the edge of the stage for his final words, the entire studio held its breath. His voice was calm but firm. His words were measured but cutting. He didn't yell. He didn't insult her back. He simply stated the truth as he saw it. He acknowledged Whoopi's position as host, but he apologized for how it ended, showing more grace in his exit than Sonny had shown during the entire interview. He made it clear he was leaving by choice, not because he couldn't handle tough questions, but because he wouldn't tolerate disrespect. That distinction was important. He'd answered her questions. He'd engaged with her points. He'd tried multiple times to have a real dialogue, but when it became clear that she wasn't interested in dialogue, only in accusation, he made the decision to leave. The cameras captured everything. His measured steps off the stage, the sad smile on his face as he shook his head at Sonny's final insult, the way he disappeared behind the curtain without looking back, the chaos that erupted the moment he was out of sight. Sonny's voice had gotten higher and more strained as the confrontation escalated. What started as pointed questions had devolved into personal attacks. What began as an attempt at tough journalism had become a spectacle of self-righteousness. She'd accused him of deflecting when he tried to answer. She'd accused him of lecturing when he defended himself. She'd accused him of running away when he chose to leave. Every response he gave was twisted into evidence of his guilt in her narrative. The audience had watched it all unfold in real time. They'd seen a friendly interview announcement turn into an ambush. They'd seen a gracious guest try to engage honestly, only to be shut down repeatedly. They'd seen a host forget that her job was to facilitate conversation, not dominate it. When security had to step in to calm the crowd after Conan left, it spoke volumes about how badly things had gone. When Whoopi had to cut to commercial early, it showed that even she knew this had spiraled beyond control. When the other hosts sat in stunned silence, it revealed that this wasn't planned, wasn't expected, and wasn't okay. The studio audience that day went home with a story they'd never forget. They'd witnessed television history, but not the kind anyone wanted to make. They'd seen what happens when righteousness becomes self-righteousness, when challenging becomes attacking, when conversation becomes confrontation. They'd seen a beloved comedian maintain his composure under fire, answer questions honestly, and finally draw a line when basic respect was abandoned. They'd seen him choose dignity over engagement, self-respect over performance, and walking away over being a punching bag. And they'd seen a host so convinced of her own moral superiority that she couldn't recognize when she'd become the villain in her own story. So focused on calling out perceived privilege that she abused the very real privilege of her platform. So determined to prove a point that she forgot the human being sitting across from her. The moment Conan's footsteps faded behind that curtain, everyone in the studio knew they'd just witnessed something that would be talked about for years. Not because of what was said about privilege or inequality, or any of the issues Sonny claimed to care about, but because of how it was said. How a simple interview became a public shaming. How a conversation became a casualty. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In trying to call out unfairness, Sonny had created one of the most unfair television moments in recent memory. In trying to challenge power, she'd abused her own. In trying to speak truth, she'd revealed more about herself than about her target. The cameras had captured every second, every accusation, every interruption, every eye roll and dismissive gesture, every moment of Conan trying to engage and Sonny shutting him down. Every uncomfortable glance between the other hosts, every shift in the audience's mood. And when those 42 seconds from first question to full confrontation had passed, when Conan made the decision to remove his microphone and stand up, the die was cast. What followed was simply the inevitable conclusion of a conversation that was never meant to be fair, never meant to be balanced, and never meant to be anything other than an attack. The studio went to commercial with chaos still echoing through the halls, producers scrambling, hosts arguing, audience members demanding explanations, security trying to maintain order, and somewhere backstage, a comedian who'd simply come to promote his work and share some laughs was probably wondering what had just happened. But he knew. Everyone watching knew. Sonny had decided before he ever sat down what story she wanted to tell. And when reality didn't match her narrative, when he didn't play the role she'd assigned him, when he refused to confess to crimes he didn't commit, she couldn't handle it. So she got louder, more aggressive, more personal, until the only choice left was to stay and be degraded or leave and preserve some dignity. Conan chose dignity, and in doing so, he revealed exactly who the real problem was in that studio that day. The audience's reaction as he walked away said everything. The mix of support and anger and confusion reflected a room full of people processing what they'd just witnessed. Some were angry at Sonny for the ambush. Some were angry at Conan for leaving. But everyone was affected by the raw tension and disrespect that had filled the air. When Whoopi finally managed to cut to commercial, when the lights dimmed and the audience buzz grew louder, when producers rushed onto the set to figure out what to do next, the damage was already done. You can't unring that bell. You can't take back those accusations. You can't pretend it didn't happen. Sonny stood there in the chaos, still insisting she was right, still claiming moral victory, still unable or unwilling to see what everyone else saw, that she'd gone too far, that she'd crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed, that she'd turned a platform into a weapon and a conversation into an assault. The other hosts knew it. The audience knew it. The producers knew it. Everyone knew it except the one person who most needed to understand. And that, perhaps more than anything else that happened that day, revealed the true tragedy of the moment. Because somewhere in Sonny's intentions might have been genuine concerns about real issues, But those concerns got lost in the execution. They got buried under personal attacks and assumptions and a refusal to actually listen. They got drowned out by her own voice, so loud and so sure and so unwilling to make space for any perspective but her own. And so, what could have been a meaningful dialogue about difficult topics became instead a cautionary tale about what happens when we forget that the people we disagree with are still people. When we decide that being right is more important than being decent. When we use our platforms not to illuminate, but to dominate. The studio that day saw it all, heard it all, felt it all. And when Conan O'Brien walked off that stage, microphone in hand, dignity intact, he didn't just leave an interview. He left a statement about what respect looks like, about what boundaries matter, about when enough is enough. And Sonny Hostin, standing there in the wreckage of what should have been a simple interview, shouting after a departing guest, insisting on her righteousness even as the room turned against her, became a living example of what he'd been trying to explain all along. That good intentions don't excuse bad behavior. That important conversations require respect. That you can't bully people into seeing things your way. The cameras caught it all. Every uncomfortable second. And those 42 seconds that started it all would be replayed and analyzed and debated for years to come. Not because of what was said about privilege or opportunity or any of the buzzwords that filled the air, but because of what it revealed about how we talk to each other, how we treat each other, how we forget sometimes that winning an argument means nothing if you lose your humanity in the process. That day in that studio, with those lights and those cameras and that audience, everyone learned something. Some learned it by watching. Some learned it by participating. And one person, standing alone on that stage as her colleagues looked away and her audience turned against her, should have learned it, but probably didn't. That respect isn't optional. That dignity isn't negotiable. And that sometimes the person walking away is the one who truly understands what really matters.